I never thought I'd end up in a hospital at 27, but life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. The accident wasn't even that dramatic, just a stupid moment of distraction while driving home from work, a sudden swerve, and then the screaming metal and shattered glass. When I woke up in the emergency room, everything hurt and nothing made sense. The doctors said I was lucky, just a broken arm, some bruised ribs, and a concussion that meant I'd need to stay for observation. Lucky, that's what they called it. But lying there in that sterile room with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, I'd never felt more alone in my entire life. My name is Adrian, and I've always been good at being alone. Not lonely exactly, just comfortable in my own company. I moved to the city 3 years ago for a job in graphic design, left behind my small hometown where everyone knew everyone's business, and built a quiet life for myself. I had work friends, gym acquaintances, people I'd grab coffee with occasionally, but no one I'd call in an emergency. No one who'd show up at a hospital at 2 a.m. My parents were 5 hours away, and I'd already told them not to drive up, that I was fine, that it was nothing serious. Pride, maybe, or just not wanting to be a burden. So there I was, alone in room 412, trying to sleep despite the pain and the constant beeping of machines and the sounds of the hospital at night. That's when I first saw Elliot. He came in around midnight for the shift change, and I remember thinking he looked tired. Not exhausted, but like someone who'd already lived a full day before starting another one. He was maybe a year or two older than me, with dark hair that was slightly too long and kept falling into his eyes, and he had this way of moving that was both efficient and gentle at the same time. He checked my vitals without saying much at first, just the standard questions about pain levels and whether I needed anything. His voice was quieter than I expected, almost soothing in the harsh brightness of the hospital room. I told him I was fine, which was a lie, but what else do you say? He looked at me for a moment, really looked at me, and something in his expression shifted. He didn't call me out on the lie, just nodded and said he'd be back to check on me in a couple of hours. But before he left, he adjusted my pillows without being asked, made sure the water pitcher was within reach, and dimmed the lights just enough that the room felt less like an interrogation chamber. It was such a small thing, but it made my throat tight with an emotion I couldn't quite name. The first night was the worst. The pain medication made me foggy but didn't actually help me sleep, and every time I started to drift off, I'd jerk awake with my heart racing, reliving the moment of impact. Around 3 a.m, I must have made some sound because suddenly Elliot was there. He didn't turn on the bright lights or make a fuss, just came in with that quiet way of moving and asked if I was okay. I wanted to say yes, to maintain that wall of I'm fine that I'd built up over the years, but something about the darkness and the vulnerability of being broken made the truth spill out instead. I told him I couldn't sleep, that I kept seeing the accident, that my mind wouldn't shut off. He pulled up a chair and sat down next to my bed, which wasn't something I expected. Most of the other nurses had been perfectly professional but distant, doing their jobs efficiently before moving on to the next patient. But Elliot sat down like he had all the time in the world, even though I'm sure he had a dozen other patients to check on. He started talking to me, asking questions that had nothing to do with my injuries. Where was I from? What did I do for work? Had I always wanted to be a designer? His questions were genuine, not just small talk to fill the silence, and before I knew it, I was telling him about growing up in a small town where I never quite fit in, about discovering design in high school, about the freedom of moving to a city where I could just be myself without everyone watching and judging. He listened in a way that made me feel heard, really heard, and somewhere in the middle of our conversation, the tightness in my chest started to ease. When I finally asked him about himself, he smiled this small, almost shy smile, and said he'd been a nurse for 5 years, that he'd always wanted to help people, that the night shift suited him because it was quieter and he could spend more time with patients instead of rushing through tasks. There was something in the way he talked about his work, a genuine care that went beyond professional duty. He told me that the hardest part of nursing wasn't the medical stuff, it was seeing people go through difficult things alone, and that no one should have to face pain or fear by themselves. I don't know what time it was when he finally stood up to continue his rounds, but I felt better than I had since the accident. Before he left, he did something that surprised me. He reached out and squeezed my hand, just for a second, and said he'd check on me again soon. It was such a simple gesture, but I felt the warmth of his touch long after he'd gone, and for the first time that night I actually fell asleep. The next day passed in a blur of different nurses and doctors, tests and evaluations. Everyone was professional and competent, but I found myself watching the clock, waiting for the evening to come, waiting for Elliot's shift to start. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was just latching onto the one person who'd show me kindness because I was vulnerable and hurt. But when 8 o'clock rolled around and he appeared in my doorway with that same quiet presence, something in me lifted. He greeted me with a smile that reached his eyes and asked how my day had been. We fell into conversation easily, like we'd known each other longer than just one night. He told me about a patient who'd brought him homemade cookies, about the hospital cat that sometimes wandered through the corridors at night, about the sunrise he'd watched from the break room window that morning before going home. I found myself hanging on his words, noticing the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the way he gestured with his hands when he got animated about something. Over the next few nights, as I recovered and waited for the doctors to clear me for discharge, Elliot became the highlight of my days. He'd stop by my room multiple times during his shift, sometimes for legitimate medical reasons, sometimes just to talk. We discovered we had similar tastes in music, that we'd both tried and failed to learn guitar, that we were both terrible at cooking but loved trying new restaurants. He told me about his small apartment with too many plants, about his college roommate who was still his best friend, about the book he was reading that he couldn't decide if he loved or hated. I started noticing things I shouldn't have been noticing. The way his scrubs fit across his shoulders, the small scar above his left eyebrow that he said was from a childhood bike accident, the particular shade of green in his eyes that changed depending on the lighting, the way my heart would speed up slightly when I heard his voice in the hallway, even before I saw him. I told myself it was just gratitude, just the natural response to someone who'd been kind when I needed it most. But deep down, I knew it was something more. On my 4th night in the hospital, I had a bad moment. The reality of the accident hit me all at once. The understanding of how close I'd come to something much worse, and I found myself shaking and unable to catch my breath. Elliot found me like that, and without hesitation, he sat on the edge of my bed and talked me through it. His voice was steady and calm, telling me to breathe with him, that I was safe, that panic passes and I just needed to ride it out. And then, when the worst of it had subsided, and I was left feeling embarrassed and exposed, he did something that changed everything. He took my hand and held it. Not a quick squeeze like before, but really held it, his fingers intertwined with mine, his thumb tracing small circles on my skin. He didn't let go, didn't make excuses about needing to check on other patients. He just sat there with me in the dim light of the hospital room, holding my hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. Neither of us spoke for a long time. We didn't need to. The silence was comfortable, heavy with things unsaid but somehow understood. When he finally had to leave, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, and said something that kept me awake for hours after he'd gone. He said that sometimes the universe puts people in our path exactly when we need them, and that he was glad I'd been assigned to his floor. It wasn't a declaration or a confession, just a simple statement. But the weight of it settled in my chest and refused to leave. The doctors cleared me for discharge on my 5th day. I should have been relieved, happy to get out of the hospital and back to my own bed, my own life. Instead, I felt a strange sense of loss. I wouldn't see Elliot anymore. There was no reason for our paths to cross again. He was a nurse who'd been kind to a patient, and I was a patient who was healed enough to leave. That's all it was, all it could be. I tried to convince myself of that as I packed up the few belongings I had with me. Elliot's shift didn't start until evening, and I was scheduled to be discharged in the morning. I told myself it was fine, that I didn't need to say goodbye, that it would be easier this way. But as the night nurse went over my discharge instructions and handed me prescriptions and follow-up appointment information, all I could think about was that I'd never see him again. I'd never hear his quiet laugh or see the way his eyes lit up when he talked about something he cared about. I'd never feel the comfort of his presence or the warmth of his hand in mine. I barely slept that last night, my mind racing with thoughts I'd been trying to suppress. I kept telling myself I was being irrational, that you can't develop real feelings for someone in just a few days, that the intensity of a hospital stay had just amplified a simple connection into something it wasn't. But the more I tried to logic my way out of what I was feeling, the more certain I became that it was real. I'd been attracted to men before, had even dated a few guys in college before deciding it was easier to focus on my career and avoid the complications of relationships. But this felt different. Elliot felt different. Morning came too quickly. I was dressed and sitting on the edge of my bed, waiting for the final paperwork and the wheelchair that would take me to the exit, when there was a knock on my door. My heart jumped, hoping against hope, and then Elliot walked in. He was in regular clothes, jeans, and a dark blue sweater, his hair damp like he'd just showered. He looked nervous, his hands shoved in his pockets, and for a moment we just stared at each other. He said he'd heard I was being discharged this morning and he wanted to make sure he caught me before I left. He said he probably shouldn't be here, that it wasn't exactly professional, but he couldn't let me leave without saying goodbye properly. There was something in his voice, a tremor of uncertainty that I'd never heard before, and suddenly I realized he was as affected by this as I was. I stood up, my discharge papers forgotten on the bed, and took a step toward him. I told him I was glad he came, that I'd wanted to see him before I left. The words felt inadequate for everything I was feeling, but I didn't know how to say more without risking too much. We stood there in my hospital room, the morning light streaming through the window, and the air between us felt charged with possibility and fear. Elliot took a breath like he was gathering courage, and then he said something that made my world tilt. He said that in 5 years of nursing he'd never connected with a patient the way he'd connected with me, that he knew it was complicated and maybe inappropriate, but he couldn't let me walk out without telling me that knowing me, even for just a few days, had meant something to him, that I'd meant something to him. My throat went tight and I couldn't speak for a moment. When I finally found my voice, I told him the truth. I told him that being in the hospital had been terrible and frightening, but that he'd made it bearable, more than bearable, that our late-night conversations had been the best part of my days, that I'd been dreading leaving because it meant not seeing him anymore, that I thought maybe, possibly, I was feeling something I hadn't expected to feel. He smiled then, that same shy smile I'd noticed the first night, and closed the distance between us. He asked if I'd want to get coffee sometime, like normal people, not a nurse and a patient, but just two people getting to know each other. I said yes before he'd even finished the question. He laughed, a sound of pure relief, and pulled out his phone so we could exchange numbers. We stood there for a few more minutes, neither of us quite ready to leave, until a nurse came in with my discharge wheelchair and reminded us that I needed to vacate the room. Elliot walked with me down to the hospital entrance, and before I got into the taxi that would take me home, he hugged me. It was careful because of my still healing ribs, but it was warm and real, and I could feel his heart beating against mine. He whispered that he'd text me later, that he was looking forward to that coffee, and then he stepped back and let me go. I watched him through the taxi window as we pulled away, standing there in front of the hospital in his blue sweater, raising his hand in a small wave. I waved back, and even though I was leaving, I didn't feel the loss I'd expected. Instead, I felt anticipation, excitement, the beginning of something I couldn't quite name yet but wanted to explore. True to his word, Elliot texted me that afternoon, just a simple message asking how I was feeling and if I'd gotten home okay. We texted back and forth throughout the day, easy conversation that picked up where we'd left off in the hospital. He asked if I was free for coffee that weekend, and I said yes immediately, probably too eagerly, but I didn't care. Our first date, because that's what it was, even though neither of us called it that at first, was at a small cafe near the park. I got there early because I was nervous and couldn't sit still at home, and I ordered a coffee I didn't really want just to have something to do with my hands. When Elliot walked in, my heart did this stupid flutter thing that I'd thought only happened in movies. He was wearing dark jeans and a grey Henley, and without the scrubs and the hospital setting, he looked different but somehow more himself. We talked for 3 hours. The coffee shop filled up and emptied out around us, and we barely noticed. We talked about everything and nothing, the conversation flowing as easily as it had in those late-night hours in the hospital. He told me about growing up with 3 sisters, about how he'd always been the caretaker even as a kid, about choosing nursing school over medical school because he wanted to spend time with patients, not rush through appointments. I told him about my complicated relationship with my hometown, about coming out to my parents in college and their confused but ultimately accepting response, about building a life in the city that felt authentically mine. At some point, our hands found each other across the table. It wasn't a dramatic moment, just a natural progression, his fingers brushing against mine and then staying there. We both looked down at our joined hands and then at each other, and Elliot smiled and said he'd been wanting to do that since I'd walked into the cafe. I told him I'd been hoping he would. When we finally left the coffee shop, neither of us wanted the day to end. We walked through the park even though it was cold, talking about movies and music and all the small details that make up a life. At some point, Elliot reached for my hand again, and we walked like that, fingers intertwined, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world, like we'd been doing this for years instead of hours. He asked if he could see me again, and I laughed and said obviously, whenever he wanted. He suggested dinner later that week, and then a movie the week after, and suddenly we were planning a future that extended beyond just the next date. It was fast, probably too fast, but it also felt inevitable, like we were just acknowledging something that had already been decided in those quiet hospital nights. Over the next few weeks, we fell into a rhythm. Elliot worked night shifts, so we'd meet for breakfast after his shift ended, sitting in diners while he unwound from work and I prepared for my day. We'd text throughout the day, silly messages and photos and random thoughts. On his nights off, we'd have proper dates, trying new restaurants or watching movies at his apartment or mine, gradually learning each other's habits and quirks. I learned that Elliot was terrible at remembering to water his plants despite having dozens of them, that he sang off-key in the shower, that he got invested in cooking competition shows even though he never cooked. He learned that I was obsessive about organising my workspace, that I got grumpy if I didn't have coffee by 9 in the morning, that I had a weakness for bad action movies. We learned each other, and every discovery felt like a gift. The first time he kissed me, really kissed me, was about 3 weeks after that first coffee date. We were at his apartment, supposedly watching a movie but really just talking, and there was a moment where the conversation lulled and we were just looking at each other. He reached up and tucked a strand of my hair behind my ear, a gesture so tender it made my breath catch, and then he leaned in slowly, giving me time to pull away if I wanted to. I didn't want to. I met him halfway, and when our lips touched, it felt like coming home. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, both of us still learning each other. But then he deepened it, his hand coming up to cup my face, and I felt it all the way to my toes. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathing hard, and Elliot rested his forehead against mine and whispered that he'd been wanting to do that since the hospital. I told him I wished he'd done it sooner, and he laughed and kissed me again. Things progressed naturally from there. We spent more and more time together, our lives gradually intertwining. He met my work friends, and I met his college roommate, who interrogated me thoroughly before giving his approval. We had our first fight about something stupid, I can't even remember what, and learned how to navigate disagreement without it feeling like the end of the world. We had lazy Sunday mornings and stressed weekday evenings, and all the ordinary moments that make up a relationship. About 2 months in, I realised I was in love with him. We were at the grocery store, of all places, arguing good-naturedly about whether we needed more vegetables or if we should just order pizza, and I looked at him laughing about something silly and just new. The realisation didn't scare me the way I thought it would. It felt right, inevitable, like my heart had known before my brain caught up. I didn't tell him right away. I wanted to find the right moment, the perfect time. But life doesn't always offer perfect moments. Instead, I told him on a random Tuesday evening, lying on his couch with my head in his lap while he played with my hair. I just looked up at him and said it, simple and true. I love you. He went still for a moment, his hand pausing in my hair, and I had a brief moment of panic that maybe I'd said it too soon, that I'd misread everything. But then he smiled, this huge, genuine smile that transformed his whole face, and said he loved me too. Said he'd been in love with me since those hospital nights, maybe even since that first night when he'd held my hand through my panic. We stayed there on the couch for hours, just holding each other and talking about everything and nothing, and I felt a peace I'd never experienced before. Looking back now, 6 months after that accident that brought me to the hospital, I can see how everything changed in those few days. I went in broken and alone, and I came out with Elliot. People say you can't fall in love in a hospital, that it's just the intensity of the situation creating false connections. But they're wrong. Love doesn't follow a timeline or wait for convenient circumstances. Sometimes it shows up in the middle of the night in a hospital room in the form of a nurse who holds your hand and makes you feel less alone. Elliot still works night shifts at the hospital, still takes care of patients with that same gentle competence he showed me. But now, when his shift ends, he comes home to me. We've talked about moving in together officially, about building a life that's fully shared instead of divided between two apartments. We've talked about the future in a way I never let myself before, about possibilities and dreams and the kind of happiness I didn't know I was allowed to want. Sometimes, late at night when he's working and I'm alone in my apartment, I think about that scared, hurt version of myself lying in that hospital bed. I wish I could tell him that everything was about to change, that the loneliness he'd grown so comfortable with was about to be shattered by someone who saw him and chose to stay. I wish I could tell him that being vulnerable and letting someone in, really in, would be the scariest and best thing he'd ever do. But I think somehow he already knew. I think from that first moment when Elliot held my hand in the darkness, some part of me recognized that this was different, that this mattered. I think my heart knew before my head caught up, and I'm grateful I was brave enough to listen. Love isn't always dramatic or cinematic. Sometimes it's quiet and gentle, building slowly in late-night conversations and shared silences. Sometimes it's a nurse who sits by your bed when he should be making rounds, who holds your hand through panic attacks, who sees you at your most vulnerable and doesn't look away. Sometimes it's finding the person who makes you want to be less alone, who makes you believe that letting someone in is worth the risk. I never thought I'd be grateful for a car accident, but I am. Because it brought me to room 412 on the 4th floor of City General Hospital, and it brought me Elliot. And everything, all the pain and fear and uncertainty was worth it for this. For him. For us. For the life we're building together, one quiet moment at a time,